Welcome to measuring the efficacy of a multi-tier self-service strategy at PEMCO Insurance. I'm sure you're all here because you saw the buzzwords and the hyphens in the title and thought that's the one for me. So let's start by breaking down what I'll actually be talking about. We're going to talk about measuring, meaning collecting and analyzing data, specifically metadata, and we'll talk about the different data we collect to do this. I'm going to be talking about efficacy, meaning how effective our deployment is, not necessarily how efficient. Multi-tier, meaning different data products for different user constituencies. Self-service, which we're defining as decentralized and self-sufficient creation and distribution of data products. Strategy, but also objectives and tactics. It just didn't alliterate as well. At, which is the 7th most common preposition in the English language. And then PEMCO Insurance, who is my employer. We're a Pacific Northwest company providing auto, home, and boat insurance since 1949 to members in Washington and Oregon. And my name is Tim Hughes. I'm a principal Tableau developer at PEMCO, which means I'm responsible for our enterprise-level dashboards and data sources. But I also do all of our server admin and training and enablement. So in short, I'm in charge of everything Tableau at PEMCO. So before we talk about all that, I want to start with a brief history of data at PEMCO. We'll start with the Business Information Management Team and Infrastructure, which was established in 2002. And the way this infrastructure works is we take data from our source systems. We have a variety of policy processing applications, claims processing applications, some of which run on mainframes, which is shocking, but not if you're in insurance, it's not shocking. And then the data from those systems is exported and put into daily, weekly, and monthly databases, which then feed daily, weekly, and monthly static reports in Excel or as PDFs, and then those are archived in daily, weekly, and monthly shared drives. Now, in 2002, this wasn't a bad way to do things. This was actually a pretty good way to do things and a best practice even to optimize performance. But a lot has changed in the last 16 years. For example, cell phones no longer have hinges or keypads. Electric cars are no longer underpowered go-karts. And I no longer build my Halloween costume out of Connects every year, sadly. So my team was established in 2014 with a mandate of modernizing our whole data ecosystem. So on my team, we have database developers, analysts, QA engineers, a data warehouse architect, a Tableau subject matter expert, that's me, and a project manager, all of whom roll up to our manager, who reports directly to our CIO. This gives us a lot of executive access and sponsorship. Our CIO is actually a former data warehouse architect himself. And so the way our process works is we take those same source systems, pull data out of them, and put them into our enterprise data warehouse, which goes through several flows. The first thing that we do, and this is the foundation of everything, is to get historical data out of our source systems with change data capture. This allows us to analyze both then-now data and then-then data so that we have that actual history more than just what's stored in the applications. And then from there, we put that into an industry standard atomic model that we purchased from IBM. We figured no reason to reinvent the wheel when there's a standard way of doing this. The hard part is getting our data to fit into that model, which is where we spend a lot of our development time. And then from there, we put the data into a dimensional model that is more business accessible. The tables are better suited for analysis, and we build Tableau published data sources in interactive dashboards off of that dimensional model. So while we're doing this data warehouse development, we're also doing concurrent Tableau development. So as we bring a subject area online in the form of a data mart, we build new dashboards off of it. So if you look at this roadmap, which you shouldn't read the whole thing, it's a lot there. The pattern you may notice is that we bring a data mart online and then we build dashboards, data mart dashboards, data mart dashboards. All of this is just to say that if we were to wait to complete our data warehouse before we started building dashboards, we would be waiting for a very long time. And I imagine many people have come to that realization, but I can't tell you the number of IT organizations I've talked to in the past who say, once we get the data warehouse done, then we'll do Tableau. I was like, all right, so I'll talk to you in 10 years. And this has resulted in some pretty good adoption as we're able to bring more content online. So PEMCO as a company is roughly 500 employees, and our entire company has access to server. We have 16 cores. And we have currently, as of 2 weeks ago, approximately, 237 active weekly users, so a little less than half, 379 daily views, and 51 new workbooks published per month. So we'll come back to those stats at the end and provide some context for those so we can actually measure the adoption. So let's talk about what I said we're going to talk about, which is our objectives. Why is PEMCO transitioning from a centralized reporting model to a decentralized self-service model? What is our strategy for self-service? What tactics does the IM team use to enable self-service? And what outcomes have we seen thus far? I gave you a little preview of that already, but without any context, because that's how you create suspense. And then we'll also talk about our roadmap for what's next. So our objective, why is PEMCO transitioning from centralized reporting to decentralized self-service? I imagine, like many people in this room, if not all, we know that data-driven decision-making is good for our bottom line. So specifically, our goal is to foster a culture of evidence-driven decision-making. We use that term evidence instead of data so we can more broadly expand that. And we know that that will lead to better products, better customer acquisition and retention, better claims handling, all of which ultimately leads to long-term stable growth, which is often the goal of any business that's not a startup. So what is our strategy for self-service? How do we achieve that objective? First of all, we're decentralized. Departments manage their own reporting, in that dashboard consumers will provide reporting requirements to departmental analysts. Those departmental analysts will query and extract from the enterprise data warehouse. And just a note on that, this is what we're building towards, and it's already happening. We still have the old system in place because we can't just cut it off. So there's still that happening. But then departmental analysts will publish dashboards to Tableau Server. And the whole reason to do it this way is that we did the centralized model in the past. It was bureaucratic, it was painful, it didn't put the business experts close to the data, and it wasn't scalable. So our strategy is also to be self-sufficient. We want the departmental analysts to provide dashboard training to the dashboard consumers, and those dashboard consumers to view, interact, save, and subscribe on Tableau Server, so that we as the IM team can focus on building and working on the platforms themselves and use our expertise to help the departmental analysts. And as I just mentioned, the IM team is responsible for the EDW and the Tableau Server, meaning that we're governing those. This allows us to maintain some control, in which you could say we're not fully decentralized. I've seen models where each individual business unit has their own databases that they use, and they don't share across those. We strike a balance in that we centralize management of the data so that we can ensure data integrity, which ultimately leads to end user confidence. But then we can allow the Tableau desktop users to be decentralized and embedded within their departments so that we don't have to manage that aspect of it. All right, so we're also cross-functional. I mentioned before the IM team uses our expertise to assist others. And that's a really good distinction because in a centralized model, it would be business users providing us with their business requirements, using kind of their business knowledge about what's important to say, hey, build this data product for us that does these things. Whereas in our model, the departmental analyst or the end user says, hey, we need something like this. And we say, all right, in our consulting capacity, here is how you would achieve that. Let me teach you how to fish so you can do that. And we work with both departmental analysts and the dashboard consumers. Departmental analysts, we get feedback on the EDW so we can provide them what they need. We also provide Tableau desktop training and consulting. And then with the end users, we train on the platform. And I want to make a distinction there. The departmental analysts train end users on the use of the dashboards. Like, if you click this filter, it will show you these types of things. You can drill in here and get details, jump to this details dashboard, which links back to the source system, and you can continue your workflow. That's their type of training. Our type of training is on the platform, meaning you can do all those things that the departmental analyst just showed you, and then you can save a custom view, and you can subscribe on a weekly basis, and you've now automated that part of your workflow. OK, then our strategies also be integrated, meaning we meet users where they are. And our most prominent example of this is we have our company-wide internal web page called Homeport that every employee is supposed to check every day because we don't do email blasts and we put announcements on Homeport. On Homeport, there's a button called Insight, which links to a reporting portal, which is a dashboard of dashboards. And in that reporting portal, someone can look at the company-wide important metrics, like the claims closing ratio, in-force policy growth. These are things that everyone in the company gets to see. And better than that, this model is scalable to other departments. So what I've created for the departmental analysts to use is a workbook that they can download and modify. And all they have to do is plug a parameter value. Well, first, sorry, they have to choose a tagging taxonomy. We've internally branded Insight with a capital S as our core metrics both across the company and across departments. So a departmental analyst may choose the word Claims Insight as what they want to call their important dashboards. And once they've done that, all they have to do is type it in here, and it's a parameter value, and then follow these 7 steps and tag the content they want with that tag, and they have a reporting portal complete for them. So what that ends up looking like is, for example, here's Claims Insight. And we can see there's a number of dashboards in here. We can see the usage underneath. We get to see important information about these dashboards, like what the subject is. So you can see differentiations between claims leadership and just claims. If you're a member of claims but not claims leadership, these dashboards do not show up here for you because it detects who has access and resolves the list in that way. And then also, importantly, who has access to it, so that if you've seen a dashboard, you know who else has access, so you can talk about it with them and not talk about it with people who don't have access. So as an example, we're not going to actually look at Claims Insight because that's sensitive. We'll look at Information Management Insight, which is something I mocked up for this just because the information management team tends to use Tableau Server more directly rather than rely on a reporting portal. So in the IM Insight dashboard of dashboards, we can see our overall utilization. As a team, we don't actually utilize dashboards a whole lot every day, mostly because we have subscriptions and alerts set up to tell on our dashboards to tell us when something's wrong, and that's when we check dashboards. And luckily, in the past 60 days, which we're looking at here, not a whole lot has gone wrong, which is great. We'll hope that trend continues today, because I'd like to go to Data Night Out. So if I want to look at one of these dashboards in particular, maybe our EDW ETL performance, when I hover over, I get the individual usage of that dashboard. And if I click in, I'll get that dashboard pop up in this reporting portal. So immediately at a glance, we can see there's one job that kept running when it shouldn't have. That was, I did have to email in about that one, say, what happened, guys? That one was Windows patches, which are usually the cause of the problems. So we could do all the standard things here. We can interact, et cetera, set alerts, all from right here. And then when we want to get back to our list, we just hit back to dashboards. So all of this is built in Tableau using URL actions and other fancy filter actions to hide and show sheets. And again, this is something that someone can download the workbook and just plug in a parameter value to create their own. So this way, we can scale across departments without having to create work, and then those departments can link to reporting portals like this from their own departmental home port sites, which, if you're an employee at PEMCO, you check the overall PEMCO home port site and also the departmental home port site every day for announcements and important information. Okay. So that's our strategy in a nutshell. Let's talk about some tactics. How does IM Team enable self-service? So the first way we do that is by providing differing data products, i.e. multi-tier self-service, to cater to user constituencies of varying technical skill. So we have our source systems, which we use an analogy, a food analogy for this, so sorry for everyone who hasn't eaten lunch yet, where we think of our source systems like a farm that grows the raw ingredients. And there are some users who have the acumen and the need to connect to those raw source system data, usually to fill a gap in functionality in that source system that they need real-time data for. A step up from that, we have the enterprise data warehouse, which we liken to a grocery store or a pantry where you have food bundled and packaged in easier to consume components, but it still requires effort to build something delicious, whether that's a dashboard or a meal. And then up the next level, within the EDW, we have the data marts, or we have published data sources built from the EDW. We think of those like a Blue Apron or a HelloFresh, so that you're provided all the ingredients you need and a set of pretty foolproof instructions to build something valuable and useful. And then at the top level, we have a finished meal, which is just like an interactive dashboard. All you have to do is consume and enjoy. And the reason we provide data in all of these forms is that some users have very different needs. Our product team is highly technical and runs displacement analysis, other stuff using SQL queries and Python and other technologies, and they tend to want rawer data than other people. We have some newer analysts embedded in the departments who primarily depend on published data sources because they're more familiar with the actual visualization part of using Tableau. So we meet all these needs by providing data at all levels, and we've been educating our users on how to choose which level of data for their need. We also provide training and enablement, mostly by job function. We do bi-monthly 4-hour Tableau Desktop hands-on training and bi-weekly Tableau Desktop office hours. The training is very similar to what you would get here at the conference. We do a lunch in the middle and then have training on both sides of that. The idea being that this is a good block of time that you can use to spend on training and get you out of the mindset of I need to do the next thing, need to do the next thing. This time is reserved for training. And there's top-down support for that. And then I mentioned before, we also do Tableau Server end user training, the idea being that we're training on the platform, not the individual dashboards within. Another tactic we use is to eliminate silos. One of the biggest downsides of a decentralized strategy is that analysts tend to work in silos because they don't know what everyone else is doing. If you are in the claims department as an analyst, you don't necessarily know what the product department is doing or any other department. And oftentimes, the product department needs to look at claims because they're designing products. So one of the ways we make sure everyone's on the same page is by providing the same broad access to the EDW. In the user-facing public portion of our EDW, there's no sensitive data. There's no PII. So that means there's nothing we have to worry about hiding, which means that any user who has a Tableau Desktop license gets the same access to the EDW. We don't split it up by job, by department, or any role like that, so that when we're talking about data, everyone's on the same page about what data exists and what we're talking about. Similarly, analysts have broad access to Tableau Server content. The idea being that if they have access to the data, why not give them access to that content? There are some exceptions to this when there are projects where there's like employee performance data that we don't expose, or like InfoSec data. But in general, all of the analysts who have Tableau Desktop have access to that content so that they can see if something exists before they go build it on their own. And we have had times in the past where executives have asked separate analysts to work on the same analysis, I think because they're trying to hedge their bets. And then what happens is it's just duplicate analyses, and it took up time it didn't need to. So this is one way to make sure that doesn't happen. And then we also have impact meetings, which stands for Information Management and PEMCO Analyst Community. We're not very good at acronyms. Don't ask what PEMCO stands for. So it may sound boring to say we have monthly meetings, but during those meetings, we go around and do a quick roundtable of what we're working on, and a lot of times there's impact across what people are working on and opportunities to collaborate on that comes up during those meetings. And then they're also a great opportunity for knowledge sharing. We'll usually show off recent dashboards that have been built and things outside of Tableau like lead scoring, et cetera. It's a good opportunity to learn from each other at these monthly meetings. Okay, another tactic we use is a clear process for content management. So our process is an analyst will work on a dashboard and maybe do several iterations. The analyst has the ability to publish to the test project and no other project. Once they've gone through a couple iterations on their own, maybe done a quick check with another analyst on their team, then they would move into user acceptance testing and get feedback from the people who actually using it. Once that's complete, maybe some data validation, doing all the work to get this ready for prime time. At that point, they would contact the project leader who's listed in the project description that they want to publish to and say, hey, I would like to be promoted to this project. The project leader will do their due diligence and say, did you do UAT and data validation? They'll say, yes, I did. And then the project leader will say, all right, it's been promoted to prod, and now all of the end users who had access to that production project have access to that new dashboard. And then that can be communicated via our home port, either at the department level or at the enterprise level. One quick note here, we have a single test project, but multiple production projects because we're breaking out production projects by the audience that gets to see the content in it, whereas the idea with our test project is content shouldn't remain in test for very long, so it's not going to balloon out of control. But along those lines, what happens when someone is not diligent about completing the workbook they started in test? Perhaps other priorities come up and they need to work on something else. There's an emergency. They go on a long vacation. Somehow they publish the test and we're in the middle of UAT, but something else comes up. Well, we've set up automated processes for archival. So if someone publishes to test and they don't publish for 30 days again, they're not really working on it anymore, are they? And at that point, it gets automatically moved from test to archive, mostly to keep that test clean and neat, and also so that any users who may have been part of the UAT group don't get to start using that piece of content in a production manager before it's ready for prod. Similarly, with our production project, or production projects, plural, if anything hasn't been used for 120 days, it gets moved to the archive. Now, we do have a few workbooks that operate on maybe a quarter or maybe a yearly or semi-yearly cadence, more because that's when industry data comes out that we get. But we're not designing for that. Those are the exception to the rule, and we don't want to design these processes to accommodate them, because if something moves to archive, the owner gets notified and they can move it out if they want to. But it's important to note that it moves first and then they're notified. None of this, hey, your stuff is going to move to archive if you don't do anything, because everyone says, oh no, don't move it to archive, I need that. Yeah, sure. I was one of those people at one point. I still am, but then I remember my own rules. We move it and then say, hey, it's been moved. If you want it back, you can go get it. And if you're a project leader, you can move it back to prod if you think it's prod. If you're an analyst, you can move it to test and ask to be promoted again, at which point the project leader will say, well, what have you done differently to make it have better traction with the end users because it wasn't being used. And then if something remains in our archive project for 395 days, it gets deleted. And in the 30 days leading up to deletion, the owner is notified so that if they want, they can pull it out back to either test or prod, or at least download it to their local machine to save it if they want to. So all of this is in service of making sure we have relevant content on our server and that it's not a messy cluster of content that's not being used, because that is one of the ways that your end users lose faith in what you have up there, is by being overwhelmed with content that's not relevant to them. All right, so with this setup, we have different permissions models. We pretty recently redid our entire permissions model and content organization, and one of the things we changed was how we do test projects. We used to have multiple test projects with fixed permissions. Now we have a single test project where our permissions are set on a workbook by workbook basis, the idea being that if you're publishing and you need user feedback, you need to determine your user group that gives you feedback, rather than have it set by someone else. And any analyst can publish to that test project, so it's very flexible. In the production project, our permissions are conformed, meaning permissions are fixed to the project level. Only the project leader can publish or move content there. They act as that gatekeeper to ensure quality. And all analysts can view most prod projects. I mentioned that before in terms of how we break down silos. All analysts have access to nearly everything. There are exceptions. And then the archive project is restricted. So permissions are fixed to the project, again, by me. I control that one. Only the analyst can view, so that an end user can't go in there to look at stuff, but an analyst can go retrieve stuff from it. But no one can publish or interact. The idea being that if it's in archive, it's just merely there so that we know it's there. Archive serves as a repository of information that was once useful but no longer is in case we need it back. If you're trying to interact with it in some way, it's not really archive, is it? So it should be moved out. So I intentionally limit the functionality of that project to make sure it's used in the way it should be. Okay, so another tactic that we use to enable self-service is a robust server ecosystem. And this is all in service of end user confidence. A lot of these things are to engender end user confidence because that's how you get adoption. So in our server ecosystem, we have a production server, which everyone who has server has a production server. And then we have our disaster recovery server, which we do nightly backup and restores to, so that in the event of an event, we can fail over and all we've lost is content that was published that day. And we've gotten to do that several times. It's been a great opportunity to hone our response. I blame Microsoft. It was Windows patches every time. And then we also have a test server that we do on-demand backup and restores to, usually because we want to do stress testing before we upgrade. This was especially important when we upgraded to 10.5 because there was a fundamental architecture change with how Hyper works, which impacted the amount of resources the server used because Hyper loads a full extract in memory rather than just column by column like extracts used to. So we do stress testing for those types of things. More recently, we used the test server to completely rebuild our server in terms of how content is organized and permissioned. We also have a utility server that doesn't have Tableau Server installed on it, but has utilities built by Tableau, open source utilities built by Tableau. Those utilities are TabJolt, which we use for stress testing the test server, TabMon, which we use for collecting perfmon counters from the production server to monitor hardware, and LogShark, which we use to ingest log files from the production server. That way we have a single server with several databases on it that has all this information about our deployment that we can analyze. And we'll see 23 of those dashboards in just a second. And then outside of the IM team's control, we have a separate monitoring server. This is managed by our enterprise services team that has site scope on it that just monitors a couple of those utilities. Specifically, it monitors the Tableau server service on the production server and the Tabmon service on the utility server, so we can make sure we continue to collect performance data. All right, so let's talk about some dashboards. Whoops, back one. So we do a lot of metadata analysis. I'm going to be showing 23 dashboards in pretty quick succession here. The idea that we're not going to get down to the details of how I built them all, but mostly show you how you can use data in a different way, not just for business purposes, but for monitoring deployments. So the first way we do metadata analysis is regression testing. We follow a monthly release cycle for our data warehouse, and our QA engineers need to make sure when we release something that data didn't materially change when it shouldn't have. So we have a dashboard that compares our BVT, which stands for Build, Verify, Test, environment against production. Now, if everything turns up green, that means there's no material difference between the view that this is testing. If there's any red in the view, then it means there's a material difference somewhere. And then our QA engineers can interact with this to figure out where, and then do the necessary code follow-up to figure out why. We do a lot of Tableau Server usage analysis using Tableau Server's Postgres repository, which is a great place to start if you want to do metadata analysis, because you don't have to set anything up other than enable permissions for the read-only user. And there's a ton of information there. You can even force download the admin views in the admin portal in Tableau Server by tricking the temp file into displaying and then grabbing it before it goes away. So that's a great place to start, mostly so you can reverse engineer the data source. Those dashboards are crap. Don't use those. So the first way we do metadata analysis with the Tableau Server repository is looking at when content was last used. This is a precursor to any content that may be archived, so that a content owner can go in here and say, OK, what's at risk of being archived, so that I can do some user follow-up to figure out why it's not being used. And they can filter to usage, including themselves. There's plenty of dashboards where the owner of that dashboard has built something for themselves, and they need to track it themselves. But they can also look at usage excluding themselves to see, are the people they're building it for using it. We also look at more general utilization. In this dashboard, we're looking at events by various attributes. Let's actually take a closer look at this one. So in this dashboard, we can see that without looking at the specific types of events, that Darlene, who's at this conference learning a lot today, is the most prolific user of Tableau Server. But one thing to note here is that of our event types, there's access data source, access view. Access data source happens a lot. So a good thing to know if you're going to be analyzing Tableau Server's Postgres repository is what events occur in conjunction with one another. So when someone accesses a view, and if that view is built off of a published data source, they also access the published data source. But if someone receives a subscription, and that subscription is built up of a view that uses a published data source, that also is a data source event. So there's a significant amount of double counting going on here. So let's look just at views. OK. So Darlene's still at the top, followed by me. It's to be expected as a server admin, constantly testing things. Nathan, Paul, who's our VP of Claims, who's a very heavy Tableau user. He even has his own Tableau desktop license and publishes things weekly. And then we can see the most popular workbook is the pending claims features. I mentioned before that sometimes we build things to fill gaps in application functionality. Our claims processing system doesn't provide a way for the adjusters to track what claims they have open, which seems incredibly basic, which this dashboard is incredibly basic but extremely valuable. It's literally counts of claim features by adjuster with some user filtering. And it's used by a lot of adjusters every day with subscriptions. Okay, so these are the types of things we can look at in this dashboard and look at who's using Tableau Server and how. So we also use metadata analysis for content management. I talked about our content management process and promotion and how that works, our different projects, and the different permissions models that we have set up. But speaking of gaps in application functionality, there are gaps in Tableau's application functionality. For example, it's not possible to imitate a user as an administrator on Tableau Server and see what they have access to. So if I want to know what a single person can see and how they've been granted that permission, as a project leader, I could go into the project and see who has access to that project. But I can't see more than that. And if I'm not a project leader, I can't see anything about access. So we have a dashboard that's visible to the analysts so they can double check what their end users have access to. And in this dashboard, you can filter to the user that permissions resolve to and then see everything they have access to and whether it's granted as an individual or the group that they're granted through. Makes it easier to audit those permissions. We have a dashboard that tests if our content that we've published is following our best practices that we agreed upon during one of our impact meetings. Specifically, we look for objects that lack descriptions. All projects should have a description. All production workbooks and data sources should have descriptions so that anyone using them knows what to expect. And in a similar vein, all production workbooks need to have an about page, which is just a dashboard of text boxes that says what data is being used, what these definitions are, who the owner is, stuff like that. So that when a user looks at a dashboard, if they have questions, they can look at the about page first before contacting someone else. There are exceptions to these rules, not rules or guidelines, as Johnny Depp says. One example would be we have a bunch of workbooks in a Tableau training project that we use when we do 4-hour bi-monthly hands-on training. The audience for those is the analysts themselves, and they're designed to enable that training during that session and not to be used after that, except to be referenced later on by people who are in that session. So I don't put about pages in there, which is why I'm the biggest offender here if anyone noticed. So it's legit, don't worry. We have a dashboard that tells us which users are in which groups and the percentage overlap between groups. So we have kind of these rectilinear Venn diagrams that tell us how groups overlap, and we can filter to a user that is in that group and see what groups are a member of and what groups those groups overlap regardless of if that person's a member or not. This is really helpful for when we're setting up permissions on new projects so that we can figure out what is the best way to set up permissions so that we're getting accurate permissions but reducing redundancy. And then we have a dashboard that shows us how our content is organized. So if you're a Tableau Server admin, you can see all content, and you can look at all the different data sources, workbooks, projects, et cetera. But it's kind of hard to see how it all rolls up. And if you're not a Tableau Server admin, you can't tell what's there. So this dashboard, again, the audience is the analysts. So even if analysts already have access to nearly all projects, but they don't have access to every single project. Sorry, they have access to nearly all projects, but not all projects. What they do have access to is this viz that tells them what content exists, even if they don't have access to it. So if we want to explore through this a little bit, let's go look at the product research and analysis project. I'll just click on that, and we'll recalculate this to look at what falls underneath that. And if we want to look at a specific workbook, say this insurance score is no hit, no score, format reject, doing a little bit of data quality analysis on the data we're receiving, I can see what's inside this workbook. I can see that we have an about page, that's good. We have an all scores worksheet, an insurance scores dashboard, and a table called IntScore, or a worksheet called table IntScore. So I'm just looking at this, I might do some follow-up with a dashboard owner to say, hey, do you actually need these free worksheets in there, or were they just published along with the dashboard because you said select all or publish all when you published? And that happens a lot. People don't know you can select just specific sheets, and everything gets and it ends up being published, and we have redundant content, which erodes user confidence when there's just extra content that's not relevant or is redundant. But we can also see that there's an embedded connection called custom SQL BIM reporting weekly. Remember I said BIM is our old system that we're actively trying to deprecate. So I also said that it's not fully deprecated yet. It's an active project, and it's one of the major milestones is going to come to a head in about 2 weeks, where we're going to deprecate the weekly and monthly databases and keep the daily one, but move it to the same server as the EDW. So suffice it to say, there's going to be a lot of user impact from that. So if we want to know what all is connected to BIM reporting weekly, that database, I can just click on that, and now we see all the content connected to that database and how it rolls up. And for example, looks like Rebecca is going to be most impacted. I'm sure if she weren't here at conference, she would be busy switching connections. So, but this allows us to tell who's impacted, and I actually have a custom view that tells us all the different BIM connections, because we have the daily and the weekly and several C names that are also used. So this is something that we can use with the group of analysts to identify that impact from that project and make sure that everyone is aware of the content that's going to be impacted. Sorry, what's that? Yeah. The question was, are we using this to inform migrations? Yeah, by identifying all BIM content, it also helps us identify what needs to be migrated at some point. The challenge with that is that the EDW work is quite slow because of the source tables from our applications are very odd. So everyone wants to migrate and wants to get off of BIM for the most part, despite putting the work aside, everyone wants to do it. The issue is timing. All right, so we also have dashboards that monitor hardware performance. I mentioned we have that utility server where we run tabmon to collect perfmon counters from the production server. So we can look at processing counters or network counters or disk counters or memory counters. Let's take a look at this one, mostly because I want to know if I can go to data night out or if I have to troubleshoot memory problems. So bear with me while I figure out my plans for tonight. OK, memory is at 40%. We're great. I can go. Except that we're actually looking at multiple servers here. You can use tabmon for monitoring not just your Tableau server, but any server. It doesn't monitor the Tableau processes. Well, it does monitor processes. It doesn't require Tableau to be installed to use it. It's just taking perfmon counters and throwing them in a Postgres database on regular intervals. We take perfmon counters every minute, and we keep data for 90 days. So if I want to look at just the Tableau prod machine instead of these other servers that are in our EDW, let me uncheck these ones. And let's make sure Tableau prod is OK. Oh, even better. I'm still going. All right. So this is really helpful for looking at, do we potentially have a memory leak? Are we maxing out on memory, and is memory constantly increasing? Stuff like that. All right. So in addition to hardware performance, we measure application performance. And we have two applications that we're responsible for. And I'm calling the EDW an application in terms of the jobs we run on it are not hardware specific. And then we also have Tableau Server. So we saw a preview of this dashboard earlier in the reporting portal. This one tells us how long our ETL jobs are taking. And this one's been really useful in terms of identifying if there's going to be user impact from a long-running ETL job. So we do nightly ETL jobs. And then our extracts start running at 5 a.m. And if our ETL jobs run past 5 a.m., the extracts run and they complete, but they're empty, which is worse than failing. So we've been using this to alert the IM team when the ETL jobs run past 5 a.m. so that we can identify, based off of the jobs that have run, whether we need to rerun all extracts or whether it's just the claims data sources that are impacted, because those run last. We also have, since having to do this several times and became more of an issue when we were migrating other databases onto the EDW, have come up with a better solution that's going to be deployed, is already being deployed as we speak, that is just going to revoke access to the Tableau Server service account during our EDW deployments. So that way extracts fail instead of complete with no data. And that way owners get notified. There's a next separate extract dashboard, which we'll see in a minute. We also measure HTTP requests from users. I've definitely used this dashboard when a user reports that, they say Tableau Server performance is poor, and I say, we'll see about that. And they tell me what they're looking at and what's happening. I can say, yeah, I see the event that's taking a long time. You're way over here on the right of this graph. It looks like you're connecting to a workbook that uses a custom SQL query live against an underpowered server. So maybe don't do that. So it is useful for identifying if we have a server-wide problem or if it's just a particular workbook or a particular user that's having issues. All right, I mentioned we have an extracts dashboard. Raise your hand if you've ever received an email from Tableau Server that says your extract failed. Raise your hand if it gave you some meaningless error message like connection failure. Yeah. Raise your hand if you knew that the Postgres repository has much more detailed information about that error. Yeah, fewer people than who raised their hands before. The Postgres repository has extremely detailed error messages. So we primarily use this dashboard when extracts fail. The nice thing about this dashboard is it has user filtering built in so that by default it filters to my extracts, which are defined as extracts that I own or extracts that are contained within projects that I lead. So that way, the person who gets notified is not just the extract owner, but also the project leader. That way, if the extract owner is, say, on vacation or at a conference, the project leader can take action. And then they get a very detailed message to work off of. For example, a lot of times they'll say, Tableau Server service account could not log into this database. And then we go talk to the DBAs and find out that there was a deployment that went out that reset the credentials, and we need to add the service account back. And then it's solved. All right, and then we also, when measuring application performance, look at backgrounder load. So extracts are one type of backgrounder activity. There are a bunch of others. So for example, there's maintenance that runs, there's Active Directory syncs, data alerts. There's a lot of things that are happening in the background on the backgrounder. But if we look at, say, refresh extracts, rather than looking at the individual, say, error messages that we're getting, we can look at the overall load that's being exerted on the server. So what we see here is extracts that were successful and running at the time that this was extracted because of the data packing, the minute packing in this dashboard. It doesn't perform well live. Unfortunately, it's an extract. We can see that extracts started at 5 o'clock, which is when our first refresh schedule runs. And all of a sudden, there was a bunch of extracts queued up at 5 o'clock that slowly Tableau worked its way through. We have four processes running on our backgrounder at any given time. And then eventually, by 5:54, we were done with the last extract in that batch, and our next batch started at 6 o'clock. So this helps us plan the timing of things. So we know we've used this dashboard to identify times that we can do database replication onto the EDW so that we're not conflicting with other processes that are happening. OK, so we also do load testing on Tableau Server. I mentioned that we have the Tabjolt utility that runs on the utility server that we use to test the test server. Load testing is a combination of hardware testing and application testing. So we have that same memory dashboard slightly modified, the same processing dashboard slightly modified. These ones are really useful because they tell you when a test was running and when it was not, so we can watch to make sure resources are released after the test to make sure there's no leaks. And disk, then we also get network, and then we get error messages that occurred during the test. And the way Tabjolt works is you pick a set of dashboards and a number of users to simulate. And I've scripted it so that we dynamically query for the top 1, 10, 20, and 100 workbooks that are used, and then run a load of 10, 20, and 100 users, and take all permutations of that to get a lot of data about how the server performs under different types of load, accessing different workbooks. And then that load we visualize here. So this is set to the last load test we did, which was prior to upgrading to 2018.1. And we can see the different user loads simulated. We see that 100 users simulated on the top one view had some pretty poor performance, average of over 20 seconds. So we saw in one of the other dashboards that that top one view is the pending claim features. That dashboard uses user filtering that has parameterized user filtering with a contains function in it as well. So it's not the most efficient way to perform user filtering, but it is really the best way to perform hierarchical user filtering if you want someone's manager to see all the stuff that rolls up. So there's not, that's a performance sacrifice we make to get better functionality. But it does mean when you consistently hit a single view with 100 users at a time, that it slows down. So if we look at a more reasonable load, say the top 20 views with 20 concurrent users, we can see that we're looking at, like a 90th percentile response of 2.7 seconds. If we wanted the median, we could switch to that. OK, so that's all our metadata analysis. Well, it's not all of it. It's some of it. But that's how we primarily do metadata analysis, is in those categories. The last aspect of our strategy is communication. So we do communication by department, job function, and dashboard access. So I already mentioned we have this website called Homeport on which we do announcements. We recently revamped the Insight portal to just update its look and work off of the Postgres repository instead of a static list of it in Excel. And we sent out a company-wide announcement letting everyone know. And of course, we saw usage spike immediately. We also do subscriptions as a form of communication. I've mentioned some of the subscriptions that we use among the analysts, but those are mostly when something goes wrong. We have another subscription that goes out that shows everyone what happened on Tableau Server during the past week. So one of the drawbacks of a decentralized model is that those silos that can happen. And the way you break through those is through effective communication, and more specifically, automated communication so that someone doesn't have to spend time doing it. And so this subscription that goes out tells everyone who's an analyst what happened on Tableau Server last week, because one of the pain points was we don't know who's working on what, or what's being published. Something you saw today when Keisha did her demonstration of getting an update in Slack. We do something similar, except we just use subscriptions, where I can see everything that happened last week on Tableau Server. So if I go look at, say, Darlene, who's a claims analyst, I can see that Darlene's been publishing workbooks, and she even deleted one workbook. I can see what projects she's been publishing them to, what they're called. If I go look at, say, Susan, I can see that her system user full name was updated. Maybe there was a name change. Or, for example, I see when new users are created. Samantha is a new employee, so we know that she was automatically created in Tableau Server because an Active Directory group synced. So a system user was created and a site user, both for Samantha. And then I can look at, for example, TC18 dashboards, which is what I've been showing you. They're all collected in one workbook for this purpose. And I can see that leading up to conference, I was working on these a lot. Weird. So the point is, but this is set to the last 8 days, and it goes out on Friday morning, and with the subject line, Tableau Server Week in Review, so that someone can look at it and see what exactly happened last week and be up to date. And we use it as a form of automated communication among the analysts to break down those silos. OK, so those are the tactics we use to enable self-service. So to summarize, we have an objective, which is to foster a culture of evidence-driven decision-making. Our strategy is decentralized, self-sufficient, governed, cross-functional, and integrated. Our tactics are training and enablement, eliminating silos, content management, robust server ecosystem, metadata analysis, and communication. And now the big question. Have we been successful? I showed you some stats at the beginning without any context to build suspense. So let's provide some context. So we've seen a 229% increase in weekly users over the past year. I'm feeling pretty good about that. We've seen a 231% increase in the rate of new content production over the past year, but this one's a little more volatile as people go through, there's different monthly cycles depending on the department, like finance, for example, is beholden to year end. We've seen a 479% increase in usage over the past year, usage being defined as people viewing dashboards or receiving subscriptions. All of those are good news. The one disappointing finding is that the top 20% of users, the 9th and 10th decile in this graph, make up 78% of our usage. Even when you control for the IM team, which includes me and another Tableau desktop or user who's very prolific, this number only changes to 76%. So while this is disappointing, this is very much in line with the Pareto principle that states that 80% of the effects are due to 20% of the causes. So while it's disappointing, it's not unexpected. But I still think it's somewhere we can improve and get this distribution a little more even. OK, so last, what's next for us? So there's a couple small projects I want to get working on right after conference. First of all, I want to establish guidelines for project leaders to use for content promotion. When we implemented our content management, we kind of talked in broad strokes about what it means to be a project leader and what those responsibilities are without providing like a checklist of things to do. Not saying that you have to do this every time, but here are the things to consider when you're promoting content. And that way the IM team can act as kind of a steward of best practices for content management. I also want to automatically rename archived workbooks to include owner and date of archival. Part of this is because if you have a workbook with the same name, two workbooks with the same name, and one's already in a project, you cannot move the other one into that project because there's no ability to overwrite when you move. So that's a little disappointing and has to be handled manually currently because there's no way to rename either via the REST API, which is what we use to move workbooks. So luckily, that feature will be coming soon, I've been told. So we'll be able to rename. I also want to automatically notify all users in the company when new production dashboards that they have access to become available. My vision for this is a dashboard that identifies production content based on user filtering and goes out weekly to say, here's what's new this week, or here's what's been updated, or here's what's hit a milestone, and if you're not looking at it yet, you probably should. The tricky part about that is that when you subscribe a group in Tableau Server, you don't actually subscribe the group. You subscribe the users who are in the group at that moment. So it doesn't update dynamically. So that'll be solved through either REST API or one of the command line options. And then I also want to set up integrations for SharePoint, Python, and R, just because We have users who use all of those. We're a big SharePoint shop for, we build our home port site out of SharePoint. We want to get into that. We have Python users in product, R users in product, and other places. And then a couple large projects. My manager and I are working on data literacy workshops to help the business units develop better data strategies so that they can actually provide the feedback that the application engineers at PEMCO need to get better data from start to finish. And then data warehouses are always a large project no matter where you are in them. So we're going to continue working on a data warehouse, bringing more subject areas online until we can make the complete switch, which we haven't been able to do yet, but we're making progress. All right, so that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for your time and for attending. If anyone has questions, wants to reach out, my email is tim.hughes@pemco.com. Please make sure to fill out the survey in your app, and we have no time left for questions, but I'm happy to stay after and answer any if anyone has them.